When former soldier Arundel Castro walked into Havenbrook Medical Center with nothing but a worn collection of storybooks and a volunteer badge. He had no idea that his quiet Tuesday evening readings would save more lives than any surgeon's scalpel ever could. For 6 months, this single father had been showing up after his warehouse shifts, his gentle voice drifting through the pediatric ward as he read tales of brave knights and magical forests to young patients whose nights were filled with monitors, medications instead of dreams. But everything changed. The night Dr. Vesha Morno, the brilliant surgeon who'd performed over 3,000 operations without shedding a single tear, heard his voice coming from room 427. What she witnessed through that doorway wouldn't just shatter her carefully constructed emotional walls. It would reveal a devastating truth about the little girl in that bed and the connection between them that nobody saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Havenbrook Medical Center's pediatric ward cast harsh shadows across 8-year-old Amelia Thornfield's pale face as she lay rigid in her hospital bed, her small fists clenched around the thin blanket. The heart monitor beside her bed showed elevated readings, not from her recovering kidney condition, but from the anxiety that gripped her every evening as darkness approached. Nurses moved efficiently through the corridor outside room 427. Their conversations about medication schedules and shift changes echoing off the sterile walls, none pausing to notice the silent terror in the young patient's eyes. The evening routine at Havenbrook was a symphony of medical precision. 4 drips were checked, vitals recorded, and medications distributed with clockwork efficiency. Yet for Amelia, each approaching night felt like drowning in an ocean of beeping machines and antiseptic smells. She'd been in the hospital for 3 weeks now, and the nights had become her enemy. Long stretches of wakeful fear punctuated by nightmares when exhaustion finally won. Her mother had visited earlier, staying just long enough to drop off fresh pajamas and remind Amelia to be brave, to not bother the nurses, to remember that Thornfields don't complain. The words had been delivered with the same efficiency as the medical care, checking boxes of maternal duty without addressing the terror that made Amelia's hands shake whenever the sun began to set outside her window. From the elevator at the end of the hall emerged Arundel Castro, his presence immediately different from the purposeful stride of medical professionals. He moved with a quiet deliberation, a canvas tote bag hanging from his shoulder, worn jeans and a simple Henley shirt making him stand out among the scrubs and white coats. His face bore the weathered look of someone who'd seen difficult things, but hadn't let them harden his expression. There was a gentleness in how he nodded to the nursing staff, a respect that came from understanding hierarchies and choosing to see people instead of positions. Arundel had been volunteering at Havenbrook for 6 months. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening after his shift at the distribution warehouse ended, the volunteer coordinator had initially been skeptical. A military veteran wanting to read stories in the pediatric ward seemed unusual. But something about his quiet insistence, his explanation that he understood what it meant to be afraid in sterile rooms far from home, had convinced her to give him a chance. He paused outside room 427, hearing the telltale signs of distress, the too quick breathing, the rustle of sheets from a restless body trying to find comfort where none existed. Through the partially open door, he could see Amelia, her eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling, her whole body tense as if preparing for battle. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in different contexts, in different places. But fear was universal in its expression, without announcement or fanfare. Arundel knocked gently on the doorframe, waiting for Amelia's startled eyes to find him before speaking. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to soften the harsh hospital lighting. "I'm Arundel, and I was wondering if you might help me with something." I have all these stories here. He patted his canvas bag. And I'm trying to figure out which one is the very best for a Tuesday night. It's a big responsibility, choosing the right story for Tuesday. Would you mind if I sat for a bit while we figure it out together? The question was carefully crafted, not offering help, which might be rejected, but asking for it, creating a sense of agency for someone who'd had very little control over anything in weeks. Amelia's grip on the blanket loosened slightly, curiosity flickering across her features. She gave the smallest of nods. Eryndel pulled the visitor's chair closer, moving it to an angle where Amelia could see him without having to turn her head uncomfortably. From his bag, he produced 3 books, each worn from handling, their covers soft from countless readings. Now here's the situation, he said, arranging the books on the bedside table where Amelia could see them. We have The Dragon Who Was Afraid of Flying, The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter, and The Magic Paintbrush. Each one has its own kind of magic. But Tuesday nights are special. They need just the right amount of adventure and just the right amount of comfort. As he spoke, his movements were unhurried, his voice maintaining a steady, soothing rhythm. He wasn't just presenting books. He was creating a ritual, a safe space within the clinical environment. Amelia's eyes moved from his face to the books, her breathing beginning to slow from its panicked pace. The Dragon book, he continued, picking up the first option, is about being brave when you don't feel brave. The dragon, you see, is absolutely terrified of heights, which is quite inconvenient when you're supposed to be flying around doing dragon things. A tiny smile ghosted across Amelia's face. The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter is about finding light in dark places, and The Magic Paintbrush, well, that one's about creating worlds when the one you're in feels too difficult. The lighthouse, Amelia whispered, her voice barely audible but present. Making a choice, taking control. Eryndel smiled. Not the practiced smile of adults trying to cheer up sick youngsters, but a genuine expression of pleasure at her participation. Excellent choice. The lighthouse it is. He settled into the chair, opening the book with care, and began to read in a voice that transformed the hospital room into something else entirely. A rocky coast, a tall tower with a bright light, a brave girl who wasn't afraid of storms. As he read, something shifted in room 427. The beeping monitors became the distant sound of waves. The antiseptic smell faded behind the imagined salt air of the story. Amelia's body gradually relaxed, her eyes focused not on the ceiling but on Arundel's face as he brought characters to life with subtle changes in tone. Never dramatic enough to be jarring, but just enough to paint pictures in the air between them. 20 minutes into the story, Eryndel noticed Amelia's eyelids growing heavy. He gradually softened his voice, slowing the pace, allowing the natural rhythm of the narrative to guide her toward sleep. When her eyes finally closed, he continued reading for a few more minutes, ensuring she was deeply asleep before carefully closing the book. As he stood to leave, he placed the book on her bedside table. In case you want to visit the lighthouse again, he whispered to her sleeping form. He pulled a small card from his pocket, hand-drawn, with a simple lighthouse and the words, "Brave sailors always find the shore," and propped it against the book, walking back toward the elevator. Eryndel passed the night nursing station where Sarah, one of the senior nurses, stopped him. "I don't know what you did, but that's the first time she's fallen asleep before midnight without sedation," she said, genuine amazement in her voice. "She's been having panic attacks every evening since admission." Eryndel simply nodded. "Sometimes we just need someone to sit in the dark with us until we remember that morning always comes," he said. "Same time Thursday?" Sarah nodded, watching as he disappeared into the elevator. She made a note in Amelia's chart. Patient responded positively to volunteer reading program. Marked decrease in evening anxiety. Continue intervention. What none of them knew was that Dr. Theshamornal had been standing in the supply room across the hall, organizing surgical supplies for the next morning's operations. She'd heard the entire interaction through the open door. Frozen in place as she listened to a stranger provide the exact comfort that she, despite all her medical training and expertise, had never thought to offer. The simplicity of it, just reading a story, just being present, stood in stark contrast to her approach of medical excellence without emotional engagement. The following Thursday evening arrived with unusual April rain drumming against the hospital windows, creating rivers of distortion that made the outside world look like an impressionist painting. Arundel Castro stood in the lobby of Havenbrook Medical Center, shaking droplets from his jacket, the canvas bag of books protected beneath his arm. He'd rushed from the warehouse, skipping dinner to make sure he arrived on time. The weight of the day sat on his shoulders, a particularly difficult shift. His supervisor breathing down his neck about productivity metrics. The constant juggle of single parenthood pulling at him from all directions. But as he entered the pediatric ward, something in him shifted, like switching from one frequency to another. The exhaustion remained, but it transformed into something purposeful. He wasn't here as Arundel the warehouse worker, or Arundel the struggling single father, or even Arundel the veteran carrying invisible scars. Here, he was simply someone who understood that hospitals at night could be the loneliest places on earth. Tonight, the ward was busier than usual. A new admission had the nursing staff rushing between rooms, and the general energy was heightened, anxious. Arundel made his way to room 427, expecting to find Amelia alone as usual, but stopped short at the doorway. A woman in expensive clothing sat in the visitor's chair, her posture rigid, speaking into her phone in clipped, professional tones. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I understand the contract needs review, but I've already explained I can't make the meeting, the woman said, her free hand gesturing with frustration. Send me the documents digitally. I'll review them tonight. She paused, listening, then continued. Yes, I'm aware of the deadline. Handle what you can without me. Amelia lay in the bed, awake, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window, her body language screaming discomfort at her mother's presence, or rather, at the way her mother was present, but not really there at all. Victoria Thornfield ended her call with an efficient goodbye and turned to her daughter with the same businesslike demeanor. The nurses say you've been sleeping better, Victoria said. Not really a question, more an acknowledgement of a report received. Good. I need you to get well quickly. Your grandmother is asking about you constantly, and I'm running out of explanations for why this is taking so long. Arundel remained in the doorway, uncertain whether to enter or return later when Amelia's eyes found him. The relief that flooded her face was so profound that it made something twist in his chest. Victoria followed her daughter's gaze, taking in Arundel's casual appearance with barely concealed dismissal. Can I help you? Victoria asked, her tone suggesting that whatever help he might offer was neither needed nor wanted. I'm Arundel, from the volunteer reading program, he said, stepping just inside the room, but maintaining a respectful distance. I usually read to Amelia on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Victoria's expression shifted to one of vague recognition mixed with irritation. Oh, right. The story thing. Well, as you can see, I'm here tonight. So that won't be necessary. The dismissal was clear. But Arundel noticed Amelia's hands beginning to clench the blanket again. The same gesture he'd witnessed that first night. He made a decision that came from somewhere deeper than politeness or protocol. Of course, he said smoothly, but I did promise Amelia we'd find out what happens to the lighthouse keeper's daughter. We left her in quite a predicament on Tuesday, stuck in the tower during a storm with the light beginning to fail. He looked directly at Amelia. I've been wondering all week if she figures out how to fix it. Amelia sat up slightly, energy entering her voice for the first time since her mother arrived. She has to use the mirrors from the old shipwreck, doesn't she? To make the light stronger? Arundel's face lit up with genuine interest. Now that's a theory worth exploring. Mind if I sit for just a few minutes to discuss it? Then I'll leave you to your visit. Before Victoria could object, he'd pulled a second chair from the corner, positioning himself in a way that created a triangle rather than excluding Victoria. Though his attention remained primarily on Amelia, he pulled out the book, its pages marked with a small origami boat he'd made from warehouse receipt paper. Where we left off, he began. Not reading yet, but recapping, drawing Amelia into the story. The storm was getting worse, and young Mira had to decide whether to stay safe in the lower levels or climb to the light room, even though the stairs were slippery with rain coming through the broken window. She has to go up, Amelia said firmly. People are counting on the light. Brave choice, Arundel agreed. But what about the fear? The stairs are dangerous, and she's never operated the light mechanism alone before. As they discussed the story, something remarkable happened. Amelia's entire demeanor changed. She became animated, her voice growing stronger, her eyes bright with engagement. She wasn't a sick young patient anymore. She was a participant in an adventure, someone whose thoughts and ideas mattered. Victoria watched this transformation with growing discomfort. She'd been telling herself that Amelia's withdrawn behavior was just part of being ill, that the anxiety the nurses mentioned was a medical issue requiring medical solutions. But here was her daughter, more alive and engaged than Victoria had seen her in months, all because a stranger was taking the time to discuss a story with her. Should I read the next chapter? Arundel asked, including Victoria in the question with a glance. We could find out if Amelia's theory about the mirrors is correct. Victoria's phone buzzed with another message. She looked at it, then at her daughter's hopeful face, then back at the phone. The moment stretched, a small eternity of choice. I should go, Victoria said, standing abruptly. I have documents to review. She bent to kiss Amelia's forehead, a gesture that felt more like punctuation than affection. Be good, I'll try to come by tomorrow. The try hung in the air like a broken promise. Amelia's animation dimmed slightly, but Arundel smoothly filled the silence. Would you like to hear about my theory before we read? He asked Amelia as Victoria gathered her things. I think the lighthouse keeper left something hidden for his daughter. Something he knew she'd only find if she was brave enough to climb to the top during a storm. Victoria paused at the doorway, looking back to see her daughter lean forward with renewed interest. What kind of something? Amelia asked eagerly. Well, Arundel said, opening the book. That's what we need to find out. As Victoria walked down the corridor, she could hear Arundel's voice beginning the chapter, followed by her daughter's laughter, actual laughter, at something in the story. She told herself she was doing the right thing, that the business documents really were urgent, that providing for Amelia's future was more important than reading stories. But the sound of that laughter followed her all the way to the Perkin garage, back in room 427. Arundel read for 40 minutes, with Amelia interrupting regularly to share observations, ask questions, and predict what might happen next. It was interactive, engaging, everything a bedtime story should be, but rarely was in the efficient world adults created. When Amelia finally began to yawn, Arundel reached into his bag and pulled out something new, a small notebook with a lighthouse drawn on the cover. I thought you might like to write your own lighthouse story, he said, placing it on her bedside table along with a set of colored pens. Sometimes when we're stuck in one place, writing about other places helps us travel without moving. Amelia touched the notebook reverently. But I'm not good at writing stories. Nobody is good at first, Arundel said gently. The secret is that every story is good if it's true to the person telling it. Even if it's about magical lighthouses and impossible storms, if it comes from you, it's true in the way that matters. As he prepared to leave, Amelia asked quietly, "Will you read my story?" "If I write one." "It would be an honor," Arundel said seriously. "In fact, I'll make you a deal. You write stories, and I'll read them. Then we can discuss them, like real authors do." The smile that spread across Amelia's face was like sunrise after a long night. As Arundel left, he passed Dr. Thesha Mornell in the hallway. She was reviewing charts at a mobile workstation, but he noticed her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Good evening." "Doctor," he said politely. She nodded, her eyes following him as he walked toward the elevator. She'd been standing there for the past 20 minutes, having finished her rounds early. She'd heard the entire reading session, the laughter, the discussion about bravery and fear. Her own childhood came flooding back nights in hospital rooms, while her mother, also a surgeon, worked late. The loneliness of being the daughter of someone who saved lives, but couldn't spare time. Dr. Thesha Mornell stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the 6th-floor surgical conference room, her silhouette sharp against the city lights below. It was nearly midnight, but she remained in her scrubs from the emergency appendectomy she'd completed 2 hours earlier. The conference room was her retreat, a place where she could review cases without interruption, where the weight of her responsibilities felt organized and manageable, contained within neat stacks of files and surgical plans. From this vantage point, she could see directly into the illuminated windows of the pediatric ward 1 floor below. Most rooms were dark, their small occupants finally surrendered to sleep. But room 427 glowed with soft lamplight, and she could make out the familiar figure of Arundel Castro. Still there hours after she'd seen him in the hallway, she watched as he sat beside Amelia's bed, apparently listening as the young patient read something from a notebook, the one he'd given her earlier, Thesha assumed. His posture spoke of infinite patience, leaning forward slightly to show engagement, nodding at intervals, his hand occasionally gesturing as if responding to something in the story. The scene triggered something deep and long buried in Thesha's precisely ordered mind. She was 7 years old again, lying in a hospital bed at Brigham and Women's after her tonsillectomy, watching the door for her mother who never came. Her mother had been in surgery. She was always in surgery. The nurses had been kind but busy, checking on her with professional efficiency before moving on to other patients. She'd spent that night creating elaborate stories in her head about a girl whose mother was a famous surgeon who saved everyone except she. Never had time to save her own daughter from the monsters that lived in the hospital. Shadows. Thesha's hand pressed against the cold window, her palm leaving a brief fog of warmth on the glass. She'd followed her mother's footsteps with ruthless precision: Harvard Medical School, residency at Johns Hopkins, fellowship in pediatric surgery at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She'd mastered every technique, published groundbreaking research, saved hundreds of young lives with her skilled hands. She'd become everything her mother was and more, surpassing her in accolades and reputation. But watching Arundel with Amelia, she realized she'd also inherited something else: the ability to compartmentalize emotion so completely that she'd forgotten it existed. In the OR, this was a gift. Her steady hands never trembled, even when operating on infants. Her decision-making never clouded with feeling, even when delivering devastating news to parents. She was a machine of medical precision, and that's what made her one of the best. Yet here was this man, this volunteer with no medical training, accomplishing something she'd never considered part of healing. He was tending to the spirit, not just the body. The realization sat uncomfortably in her chest, like a suture pulling too tight. Her phone vibrated with a text from her ex-husband. "David, noticed you haven't picked up your things from the house yet. It's been 3 months. Should I have them sent somewhere?" 3 months. Had it really been that long since their marriage officially ended? She'd been sleeping in the on-call room so often that she'd barely noticed the transition from married to divorced. David had accused her of being married to the hospital, and she couldn't argue. The divorce papers had been signed between surgeries. Just another document requiring her signature. Looking back at room 427, she saw Arundel standing now, carefully tucking the blanket around Amelia's shoulders as she settled for sleep. The gesture was so simple, so naturally paternal, that it made something crack in Nesha's carefully maintained armor. When was the last time anyone had tucked her in? When was the last time she'd allowed anyone close enough to perform such intimate kindness? Her mind went to her surgical roster for tomorrow. 3 procedures, all routine but requiring absolute focus. She should be reviewing the files, ensuring she was prepared for every possible complication. Instead, she found herself wondering about Arundel's story. What brought a man to spend his Thursday nights reading to sick youngsters? What war had he fought, and what battles was he still fighting? She'd overheard nurses mentioning he was a single father, that he worked at a warehouse, that he never missed his volunteer nights even when he looked exhausted. The sacrifice of it giving precious free time when he clearly had so little stood in stark contrast to her own choices. She had all the time in the world now, no family waiting at home, no one wondering when she'd return. Yet she filled every hour with work, convincing herself that each surgery was urgently important, that her presence was critical. But critical for what? She saved bodies with brilliant precision, but what about the souls inhabiting them? What about the fear that kept them awake at night, the loneliness that no antibiotic could cure, the need for connection that no surgical intervention could address? Movement below caught her attention. Arundel was leaving room 427, but he stopped in the hallway, leaning against the wall with sudden exhaustion. She watched him run his hands through his hair, shoulders sagging. The performance of strength he maintained for Amelia completely dropped. He stood there for a full minute, gathering himself, before straightening and walking toward the elevator. The raw humanity of that moment, the visible effort it took for him to keep giving when he had so little left, struck Nesha more forcefully than any surgical emergency she'd faced. Here was someone choosing to show up, to be present for a young patient who wasn't even his responsibility, while she, the actual doctor, kept her emotional distance even from the patients, whose lives literally rested in her hands. Her reflection in the window overlapped with the scene below, creating a ghostly double image that felt metaphorically appropriate. She was there but not there, present but not present, saving lives but not really touching them. A memory surfaced unbidden, her first successful surgery as lead surgeon, removing a tumor from a 5-year-old's brain. The parents had cried with relief, tried to hug her, but she'd stepped back, maintaining professional boundaries, discussing post-operative care with clinical detachment. She'd told herself it was necessary, that emotional involvement would compromise her effectiveness. But watching Arundel's natural warmth with Amelia, she wondered if she'd been protecting her effectiveness or just protecting herself. The pediatric ward below was settling into the deep quiet of midnight. She should go home. Her empty apartment at least had a bed more comfortable than the on-call room. But home felt like another operating room, sterile and precisely organized. Everything in its place except warmth, except life, except the messy, beautiful chaos of human connection. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was the night attending. Incoming trauma, MVA with pediatric patient. ETA 15 minutes. Need you? She was already moving toward the door as she typed back, on my way. This was easier. This was what she knew. In the OR, she could fix things with her hands, could measure success in clear outcomes, survival or death, function restored or lost. There was no ambiguity in surgery. No need to navigate the complex terrain of emotional healing. But as the elevator descended toward the A, she found herself thinking about Amelia in room 427. Tomorrow, the young patient would wake to another day of medical treatment, of vitals checks and medication schedules. Would anyone read to her during the long afternoon hours? Would anyone ask about the story she was writing in her lighthouse notebook? The elevator doors opened to controlled chaos trauma team assembling, equipment being prepared, the familiar dance of emergency medicine. Vesha stepped into it like stepping into armor, her surgeon persona sliding into place with practiced ease. But something was different now. She'd seen another way of healing, witnessed care that went beyond the physical. And the knowledge sat within her like a seed that had finally found a crack in the concrete dot as she scrubbed it in. For the emergency surgery, she made a mental note to check out Amelia tomorrow, really check, not just review charts and surgical sites. Maybe she'd even ask about the lighthouse story. It was a small thought, barely formed, but it was the first time in years that Dr. Vesha Mornell had considered that healing might require more than her surgical skills. The OR, lights blazed to life as she entered. Harsh and brilliant, nothing like the soft lamplight of room 427. But for the first time, she understood that both kinds of light were necessary. That saving a life meant more than just keeping a heart beating. Amelia Thornfield's medical chart read like a clinical textbook case. Juvenile nephritis. Responding well to treatment, expected full recovery within 4 to 6 weeks. But charts couldn't capture the suffocating reality of her daily existence at Havenbrook Medical Center, where each day blended into the next in an endless cycle of medical routine that slowly eroded her spirit. Her mornings began at 5:30 a.m., with the phlebotomist arriving to draw blood. Their whispered, "Just a small pinch," becoming a mockery as her arms turned into a map of purple bruises from repeated needle sticks. By 6 a.m., the vital signs check would wake her again if she'd managed to drift back to sleep. The blood pressure cuff squeezing her thin arm while the thermometer invaded her mouth and the pulse oximeter claimed her finger. Breakfast arrived at 7:15. A tray of carefully calculated nutrition that tasted like cardboard dressed up as food. Low sodium for her kidney function, restricted protein, measured portions that left her hungry but were deemed medically appropriate. She'd push the scrambled eggs around her plate, wondering if hospital food was deliberately made unappetizing to encourage faster recovery through the sheer desire to escape to real meals. The morning rounds began at 8 a.m. sharp. Dr. Harrison would sweep in with his entourage of residents and medical students, discussing her case as if she were an interesting specimen rather than a person. They'd use words like good prognosis and responding well to treatment while never actually looking at her. Their eyes focused on charts and monitors, occasionally lifting her hospital gown to examine surgical sites without warning. As if her body were public property, physical therapy came at 10 a.m. A cheerful woman named Beth who didn't understand that Amelia's reluctance to walk the halls wasn't physical weakness, but emotional exhaustion. The corridors were a gallery of suffering, other young patients attached to IV poles, bald from chemotherapy, crying behind closed doors. Each walk was a reminder that childhood could be stolen by disease, that bodies could betray you without warning. Bodies could betray you without warning. Lunch at 12:30 was another carefully controlled meal, followed by quiet time that wasn't quiet at all. The hospital symphony never ceased, monitors beeping, announcements over the PA system, carts rattling past her door, voices discussing medical mysteries in the hallway. She'd try to read the books her mother had brought, educational texts about brave young women in history, but the words would blur together, meaningless in the context of her current imprisonment. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Tutoring sessions via video call at 2 p.m. attempted to keep her from falling behind in school. But how could she concentrate on multiplication tables when her roommate, a 4-year-old with leukemia, was crying softly behind the curtain divider? How could she care about state capitals when her own state was one of perpetual displacement, neither sick enough to warrant constant attention nor well enough to leave? Medication rounds came at 4 p.m., a cocktail of pills that made her drowsy but unable to truly rest. that controlled her kidney function but left her feeling disconnected from her own body. The nurses were kind but overwhelmed, offering brief smiles before rushing to the next room, the next crisis, the next small patient who needed them more urgently. Dinner at 5:30 was the day's final official meal. Though dinner was a generous term for the bland protein and overcooked vegetables that appeared on her tray. Her mother would sometimes visit during this time. Though visit meant sitting in the chair while conducting business calls, occasionally looking up to ensure Amelia was eating. More concerned with consumption than companionship, the evenings were the worst. As darkness fell outside her window, the hospital transformed into something more sinister. The friendly daytime bustle gave way to skeleton crews and emergency admissions. The sounds changed: urgent footsteps, whispered conferences, the occasional wail of new grief from somewhere down the hall. The fluorescent lights dimmed but never truly darkened, creating a perpetual twilight that confused her body's natural rhythms. It was during these evening hours that the panic would build. It started as a flutter in her chest, like a bird trapped behind her ribs. Her breathing would quicken as she watched the clock, knowing that sleep should come but wouldn't. That the night stretched ahead with its parade of interruptions, vital checks at midnight and 4 a.m., medication doses that couldn't wait until morning, the constant vigilance of machines monitoring her every bodily function. She'd begun having nightmares about becoming part of the hospital itself, her body slowly transforming into medical equipment, her veins becoming 4 tubes, her voice turning into the mechanical beep of monitors. She'd wake gasping, disoriented, unsure if she was human or machine, if the tubes and wires attached to her were foreign invaders or parts of her evolving anatomy. The child life specialist had visited once, a woman with an aggressively cheerful demeanor who'd brought crafts and games meant to normalize the hospital experience. But how could anything normalize the fact that 8-year-olds shouldn't know the difference between arterial and venous blood draws, shouldn't be able to identify medications by their color and shape, shouldn't wake each morning wondering if this would be the day their body finally cooperated enough to earn freedom. Before Arundel's first visit, Amelia had developed elaborate mental escape routes. She'd imagine herself becoming invisible, slipping past the nurse's station, riding the elevator to freedom. She'd picture herself at home, in her own bed with its soft purple comforter, where the only sounds were the suburban quiet of lawnmowers and dogs barking, where morning meant cartoons and cereal. Not blood draws and vital signs, but these fantasies had been becoming darker. Sometimes she imagined not waking up at all, not from death, but from a kind of suspended animation where she could float above her body, watching but not feeling, present but not participating. It was during one of these dissociative episodes that Arundel had first appeared, his gentle knock pulling her back to reality, but offering something better than escape connection. The notebook he'd given her had become her lifeline. During the long afternoon hours, she'd write stories about Mira, the lighthouse keeper's daughter, but really she was writing about herself. Mira was brave in ways Amelia couldn't be, speaking up to adults, refusing procedures that scared her, demanding answers instead of accepting mysterious medical pronouncements. Through Mira, Amelia could express the anger she wasn't allowed to feel, the fear she was told was unnecessary, the loneliness that seemed too heavy for adults to acknowledge. She'd filled pages with adventures where Mira saved other young souls from sea monsters that looked suspiciously like IV poles with tentacles, where the lighthouse beam could heal any illness with its warm light, where storms always passed and morning always brought rescue ships full of people who understood that being brave didn't mean not being scared. It meant being scared and continuing anyway. The medical team saw her improvement through the lens of lab results and kidney function tests. Her creatinine levels were dropping, her protein markers improving, her edema resolving. These were the victories they celebrated in their morning rounds, evidence of successful treatment. But they didn't see the other metrics, The way her smile had become automatic rather than genuine. How she'd learned to give the responses that made adults comfortable rather than expressing her true feelings. The increasing disconnect between her internal experience and external presentation. Victoria Thornfield interpreted her daughter's compliance as maturity, praising Amelia for being such a good patient, for not complaining, for making this easier on everyone. She didn't understand that Amelia's cooperation came from exhaustion, not acceptance. That she'd simply learned that resistance was futile in a system designed to prioritize efficiency over emotional well-being. The nurses noticed but were too overwhelmed to intervene beyond basic comfort measures. They'd offer extra juice boxes, sneak her cookies from the staff room, let her choose the cartoon stickers for her daily chart. These small kindnesses were appreciated, but couldn't address the fundamental problem, that healing required more than medicine, that young spirits needed tending as much as young bodies, that the hospital might be saving her life while slowly crushing her soul. Arundel Castro's apartment in the Brookside district was a study in organized chaos, where military precision met single-father reality. The living room walls held two distinct types of frames, his service medals and commendations, arranged in perfect formation on one wall. His son Kieran's artwork covering every other available surface in cheerful disorder. The morning sun filtered through windows that needed cleaning, illuminating dust motes that danced above surfaces that bore the evidence of a life lived in constant motion. At 5:15 a.m., Arundel's internal clock woke him, as it had every day for the past 15 years. A habit ingrained during his service that no amount of civilian life could break. He moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency: shower, shave, coffee strong enough to fuel a convoy. By 5:45, he was standing outside Kieran's door, listening to his 12-year-old son's steady breathing, allowing himself this moment of peace before the day's demands began. The transition from Staff Sergeant Castro to just Arundel had been neither dramatic nor chosen. There had been no catastrophic injury, no single moment of breaking that made for compelling news stories about wounded warriors. Instead, it had been a slow erosion, like watching shore disappear grain by grain. The official diagnosis was PTSD with severe anxiety disorder, clinical terms that couldn't capture the reality of being unable to enter crowded spaces without mapping exits, of hitting the floor when cars backfired, of seeing potential threats in every shadow. The moment that ended his military career wasn't in combat, but in a briefing room at Fort Harrison, where he'd frozen during a routine presentation, his body suddenly refusing to cooperate. His mind trapped in a feedback loop of panic that left him gasping on the floor while his fellow soldiers watched in confusion and concern. The medical board had been sympathetic but firm. He was no longer fit for active duty. The skills that had made him an exceptional soldier, the hypervigilance and rapid threat assessment, had become liabilities in peacetime. His marriage to Claire hadn't survived the transition. She'd married a soldier, someone strong and steady. Not the man who woke screaming from nightmares, who couldn't attend Kieran's school plays because the auditorium felt like a trap, who sometimes spent entire days locked in their bedroom, paralyzed by anxiety that had no visible source. The divorce had been quiet, efficient, Claire taking her disappointment to Phoenix, leaving Kieran with a father she deemed stable enough for custody but not stable enough for love. The warehouse job at Havenbrook Distribution had been a lifeline thrown by Marcus, an old Army buddy who managed the facility. No questions asked, no pressure to be more than he could manage. The work was physical but predictable: loading trucks, organizing inventory, tasks that required just enough concentration to quiet his mind, without triggering the overwhelm that complex decisions brought. His co-workers knew he was a veteran but didn't probe, respecting the walls he built with the instinctive understanding of those who had their own unspoken struggles. It was Kieran who'd unknowingly led him to the hospital volunteering. 6 months ago, his son had been assigned a community service project for school, and they'd visited Havenbrook Medical Center together to deliver handmade cards to pediatric patients. Arundel had intended to wait in the lobby, but Kieran had insisted he come along. Grabbing his father's hand with the fierce determination of someone who refused to let their parent disappear into themselves, walking those hospital corridors had been unexpectedly manageable. The controlled environment, the clear purpose, the fact that everyone there was focused on their own struggles rather than scrutinizing him, it all combined to create a space where his anxiety loosened its grip. But it was seeing the young patients that had truly shifted something in him. Their eyes held a recognition he understood, the look of people fighting battles others couldn't see. Trying to be brave when bravery felt impossible. One young boy in particular had caught his attention. A 10-year-old recovering from surgery who sat alone in the common room, organizing and reorganizing a deck of cards with the repetitive focus Arundel recognized from his own coping mechanisms. Without thinking, Arundel had sat down and taught him a patience game he'd learned during long deployments. A simple activity that required just enough attention to calm racing thoughts. The volunteer coordinator, Mrs. Patricia Holloway, had watched this interaction and approached him afterward. "You have a gift," she'd said simply. "These youngsters need someone who understands that healing isn't always about medicine." When she'd suggested the reading program, Arundel had almost refused committing to regular appearances felt dangerous, when some days he could barely leave his apartment. But Kieran had overheard and said, "Dad, you tell the best stories. Remember all those nights when I couldn't sleep after Mom left? Your stories made everything better." The truth that Kieran didn't know was that those stories had saved Arundel as much as they'd comforted his son. In the months after Claire's departure, when the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, creating elaborate tales for Kieran had been his anchor to the world of the living. Each story was a promise that tomorrow would come, that there were still adventures to imagine, still reasons to keep fighting the war inside his own mind. His background before the military was another life entirely, one he rarely discussed. He'd grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes from age 7 after his parents died in an accident he'd survived. Books had been his escape then, libraries his sanctuary. He'd joined the military at 18, searching for the family he'd never had, finding brotherhood in service, purpose in protection. He'd been good at it, exceptional even. 3 tours in Afghanistan, commendations for valor, responsible for dozens of successful missions that saved countless lives. But the skills that made him valuable in war zones became curses in civilian life. The ability to notice everything, to assess threats instantly, to remain hyper-alert for danger. These weren't assets at parent-teacher conferences or grocery stores. The very training that had kept him and his unit alive now kept him prisoner in his own mind. Unable to turn off the constant scanning for danger that didn't exist in suburban America, the reading program at Havenbrook had become his own form of therapy, though he'd never frame it that way. The stories created a bridge between his inner world and external reality, a safe way to connect without the vulnerability of direct interaction. When he read to the young patients, he wasn't broken veteran Arundel or anxious father Arundel. He was simply a voice bringing other worlds to life, offering escape routes he'd mapped through years of his own wandering. His knowledge of childhood psychology wasn't formal but experiential. He recognized the signs of trauma because he lived them, the hypervigilance in Amelia's eyes, the way she startled at sudden sounds, how she tried to make herself small and unnoticeable. He understood the panic attacks because he'd had hundreds of them, knew the feeling of drowning in open air, of your body betraying you with fear that had no visible source. The techniques he used, the steady voice, the predictable routine, the offering of choices to create agency, weren't learned from textbooks but from his own trial and error, from discovering what helped him survive his darkest moments. The origami he'd taught himself during sleepless nights when his hands needed something to do besides shake. The breathing exercises disguised as story pacing came from years of managing his own respiratory panic. What he offered these young souls wasn't professional therapy, but something perhaps more valuable. Proof that you could be broken and still be useful. That you could carry invisible wounds and still bring light to others. That survival didn't require healing completely, but just healing enough to keep going, to keep giving, to keep connecting. His supervisor at the warehouse had recently offered him a promotion to shift manager, a position with better pay and regular hours that would make life easier in every practical way. But it would mean giving up the Tuesday and Thursday evening volunteer slots, and Arundel had declined without hesitation. The money would have helped. Kieran needed new shoes, the car was making concerning noises, the rent was increasing. But some things mattered more than financial security. "Why do you go to the hospital so much?" Kieran had asked recently. "You don't get paid, and you're always tired after." Arundel had thought carefully before answering. "Remember when you were younger and scared of thunderstorms? And I'd sit with you until they passed?" Kieran nodded. "The hospital is full of kids sitting through their own storms. I just keep them company until the thunder stops." What he didn't add was that in comforting them, he was somehow comforting the scared child he'd been. The one who'd sat through storms alone. Who'd learned to be brave because there was no other choice. Every story he read was a message to his younger self. You're not alone. Someone sees you. Your fear is valid, but it doesn't define you. The irony wasn't lost on him that he, someone who struggled to function in normal society, had become a source of stability for these young patients. But maybe that was exactly why it worked. He wasn't offering them false promises of complete recovery or trying to minimize their struggles with toxic positivity. He was showing them that you could be damaged and still have value. That you could fight battles every day and still have energy to care about others' wars. In his wallet, carefully folded, was a drawing Amelia had made during his third visit. A lighthouse with two lights. One at the top and one in the doorway where a figure stood, arms outstretched. She'd explained that the second light was just as important because it showed people they weren't alone once they reached shore. He carried it like a talisman, a reminder that sometimes the most profound healing came not from being fixed, but from fixing something in someone else. That purpose could be found in the most unexpected places. That even broken lights could still guide others home. The Tuesday evening shift at Havenbrook Distribution had been brutal. A shipment mix-up had created chaos in the warehouse, requiring Arundel to work 2 hours past his scheduled time to sort through misrouted packages, while his supervisor barked orders and threatened overtime cuts for the entire crew. By the time he reached the pediatric ward at nearly 8 p.m., his hands were shaking, not from exhaustion alone, but from the familiar onset of anxiety that threatened to derail everything he'd built. Room 427 was darker than usual when he approached. The overhead lights dimmed and only the bedside lamp casting shadows across the walls. Amelia lay curled on her side, her back to the door, the notebook he'd given her clutched against her chest like armor. She hadn't touched her dinner tray, and the untouched meal spoke volumes about her emotional state. Arundel knocked softly on the doorframe, but received no response. Through the silence, he could hear the telltale sound of suppressed crying, the careful, practiced weeping of someone who'd learned that loud grief brought unwanted attention. His own chest tightened in recognition. He'd perfected that same silent mourning during his darkest nights after Claire left, when Kieran slept in the next room and couldn't know that his father was falling apart. "Amelia?" he said gently, stepping just inside the room. "It's Arundel. I'm running late tonight, and I was hoping you might help me catch up on what I missed." Still no response, but her shoulders tensed, indicating she'd heard him. He moved the visitor's chair closer, its legs making the softest whisper against the floor, and settled into it with the patience of someone who understood that healing couldn't be rushed. "I had a rough day," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of genuine vulnerability. Sometimes the world feels too loud, too fast, too demanding. I was wondering if maybe you felt that way too. The crying stopped. Amelia's breathing changed, becoming more controlled, though she remained facing away from him. In the reflection of the dark window, he could see her eyes were open now, listening. When I was overseas, Arundel continued, pulling one of his books from the canvas bag but not opening it. We had these things called decompression days, times when everything got too intense, and we had to find ways to slow the world down again. My sergeant used to say that sometimes you have to get smaller before you can get stronger. Smaller before you can get stronger. Slowly, carefully, Amelia turned over. Her face was blotchy from crying, her eyes red-rimmed but alert. She looked younger than her 8 years, fragile in a way that had nothing to do with her medical condition. I don't want to get stronger, she whispered, her voice hoarse from tears. I want to go home. I want my mom to stay longer than 5 minutes. I want to sleep in my own bed and eat food that doesn't taste like cardboard and not have needles stuck in me every morning. The raw honesty of it hit Arundel like a physical blow. He'd spent months reading to her, creating gentle escapes through stories, but he'd been treating symptoms rather than addressing the deeper wound. She wasn't just sick, she was grieving the childhood that had been interrupted, mourning the simple life that had been replaced by medical complexity. You know what? He said, making a decision that went against every careful boundary he'd maintained. I want those things for you too. And I think it's okay to be angry about not having them. Amelia sat up slightly, surprised by this permission to feel what she'd been told was inappropriate. The nurses say I should be grateful. That other kids are sicker than me. The nurses are right that other kids are fighting harder battles, Arundel acknowledged. But that doesn't make your battle less real or less difficult. You can be grateful to be getting better and still hate being here. Both things can be true at the same time. For the first time in weeks, Amelia's expression shifted from resigned compliance to something more authentic. Mixture of relief and residual anger that felt healthy rather than destructive. She pulled her knees up to her chest, creating a small fortress of herself. My mom thinks I'm being dramatic, she said. She keeps saying this is temporary, that I need to be brave. That complaining makes things harder for everyone. Arundel felt a familiar rage building in his chest, not at Amelia or even at her mother, but at the systems that taught children to minimize their own suffering. That prioritized adult comfort over authentic emotional processing. He'd lived that lesson himself, learning in foster care that expressing needs was inconvenient. That good children made themselves smaller to fit into spaces that weren't designed for them. Being brave doesn't mean not feeling scared or sad or angry, he said carefully. It means feeling those things and continuing to take care of yourself anyway. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that something is really hard. Amelia studied his face, searching for the adult dismissal she expected. The inevitable moment when he'd pivot to reassurance and false optimism. Instead, she found something she'd rarely seen from grown-ups: complete acceptance of her emotional truth, without the need to fix it or minimize it. Will you read tonight? She asked, but not about brave girls or adventures. Something quiet. Something sad, maybe. Arundel nodded and pulled out a book he'd never read to any of the children before, a collection of stories about healing that didn't shy away from the reality of pain. He opened to a story about a tree that had lost all its leaves in a storm and was learning to grow new ones. Understanding that the new growth would be different from what came before, but still beautiful in its own way. As he read, his voice took on a different quality than usual. There was less performance, less careful modulation designed to soothe. Instead, there was raw honesty, the kind that comes from recognizing a kindred spirit in struggle. He read about the tree's anger at the storm, its grief for the lost leaves, its fear that the new growth might not be strong enough to withstand future winds. Amelia listened with an intensity That was different from her usual engagement. She wasn't escaping into the story, she was finding herself reflected in it, discovering that her own complex emotions had been written into literature by someone who understood that healing narratives didn't always end with simple happiness. The tree doesn't go back to how it was before, she observed when he finished the chapter. No, Arundel agreed. But it learns to be beautiful in a new way. And it discovers that having survived one storm makes it better prepared for future ones, even if it's different than it was before. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the story settling between them like shared understanding. Finally, Amelia opened her notebook and showed him what she'd been writing, not the adventure stories he'd expected, but a raw, honest account of hospital life told through the eyes of a young lighthouse keeper who'd been shipwrecked on a strange island where everyone spoke a language she didn't understand. It's not very good, she said, but without her usual apologetic tone. It's true, Arundel replied, and that makes it very good indeed. As he prepared to leave that night, Amelia asked a question that stopped him at the door. Arundel, are you still scared sometimes, even though you're grown up? He turned back, seeing not just a sick child but a fellow survivor, someone who deserved the same honesty he'd want for himself. Yes, he said simply, but I've learned that being scared doesn't mean I'm broken. It means I'm alive and I'm still fighting to stay that way. As he walked toward the elevator, Arundel didn't notice Dr. Vesha Mornell standing in the supply room across the hall, having witnessed the entire interaction. For the second time, she'd heard him provide exactly the kind of emotional support that her medical training had never taught her to offer. But this time, instead of feeling inadequate, she felt something else entirely, the recognition that healing required more than one kind of expertise, and that maybe it was time she learned a different way to help. Dr. Vesha Mornell stood in the hospital parking garage at 11:47 p.m., her car keys forgotten in her hand as rain drummed against the concrete structure above. The conversation she'd overheard between Arundel and Amelia played on repeat in her mind, each word highlighting the vast gap between medical intervention and human connection that she'd spent her entire career ignoring. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Harrison, the attending physician. Thornfield case: remarkable improvement in compliance and emotional markers. Whatever's changed in her care plan is working. Keep it up. She almost laughed at the irony. The change in care plan had nothing to do with medical protocols and everything to do with a warehouse worker who understood something about healing that she'd somehow missed in 15 years of practice. She'd reviewed Amelia's chart obsessively over the past week, searching for some clinical explanation for the improvement. But the answers weren't in lab results or medication adjustments, they were in the simple act of human witness that Arundel provided twice weekly. The drive to her apartment in Harbor Heights was a blur of streetlights and introspection. Her building's sleek glass facade reflected her headlights as she pulled into the underground garage, another sterile environment that matched the aesthetic of her professional life. Everything in order, everything controlled, everything empty of the messy vitality that made life worth living. Her apartment was a monument to surgical precision, minimalist furniture arranged with mathematical exactness, surfaces clear of clutter, walls decorated with her medical diplomas and surgical awards. It was beautiful in the way that operating rooms were beautiful, functional and sterile, and completely devoid of warmth. She moved through the space like a ghost, heating a frozen dinner with the same mechanical efficiency she brought to suturing, eating while standing at the kitchen counter as she scrolled through medical journals on her tablet. But tonight, the routine felt suffocating. She found herself thinking about Arundel's apartment, which she'd never seen but imagined filled with the chaos of actual living, his son's artwork on the walls, books scattered on surfaces, the accumulated evidence of a life being actively lived rather than carefully curated. The contrast made her own choices feel hollow. protective barriers that had become prison walls. She'd been avoiding her mother's calls for 3 weeks, unable to face another conversation about surgical techniques and case studies. The only topics they'd ever successfully navigated together. Dr. Eleanor Mornell had retired from practice 5 years earlier, but still attended medical conferences and published research papers. Still defined herself entirely through professional achievement. She'd raised Vesha to follow the same path, to find identity and worth through clinical excellence, to measure success in lives saved rather than relationships nurtured. The irony was that Vesha had become everything her mother wanted and more. Chief of pediatric surgery at 38, internationally recognized for her innovative techniques, invited to speak at conferences worldwide. But sitting in her pristine apartment, she realized that all her achievements felt as hollow as the space around her. Her laptop sat open on the dining table, displaying her schedule for tomorrow too. Routine procedures and a complex surgery on a 6-year-old with a rare heart defect. She'd spent hours preparing, reviewing scans and surgical approaches, ensuring every detail was perfect. But for the first time in her career, she found herself wondering about the child beyond the medical case, about their fears and hopes and the family members who would pace waiting room floors while she worked. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay in her king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling as memories surfaced unbidden. Her own childhood. Hospitalizations for minor ailments had been extensions of her mother's. Workplace Dr. Eleanor Mornell treating her daughter's strep throat with the same clinical detachment she brought to strangers' surgeries. There had been no bedtime stories, no gentle comfort, no acknowledgement that being sick was frightening for a child. Regardless of the medical necessity. She remembered one night in particular. Age 7, recovering from having her tonsils removed at the same hospital where her mother practiced. The surgery had gone perfectly, but Vesha had woken in post-op terrified and in pain, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and machine sounds that seemed menacing in her drugged state. Her mother had checked on her briefly, discussed post-operative care with the nursing staff, then returned to her own surgeries, leaving Vesha with strangers who were kind but busy, professional but not personal. That night had taught her that medical care was separate from emotional care, that physical healing didn't require attention to fears or feelings, that being strong meant not needing comfort. She'd internalized those lessons so completely that they'd become the foundation of her professional identity. Excellent technical skills married to emotional distance. Surgical precision without personal investment. But watching Arundel with Amelia had cracked something open in her carefully constructed worldview. Here was healing that addressed the whole person, care that acknowledged fear and loneliness as symptoms worthy of treatment. He wasn't just reading stories, he was prescribing hope, administering presence, treating the part of illness that couldn't be cut out or medicated away. At 3 a.m., she gave up on sleep and moved to her home office, surrounded by medical textbooks and surgical manuals. But instead of reviewing tomorrow's procedures, she found herself researching something she'd never considered before: the psychological impact of hospitalization on pediatric patients. Study after study confirmed what Arundel seemed to know instinctively, that emotional support during medical treatment significantly improved outcomes, that children who felt heard and understood recovered faster, that trauma from medical procedures could be minimized through simple human connection. The research was compelling, but it was her own memory that truly convinced her. She remembered the night nurse who'd sat with her after her tonsillectomy, a woman whose name she'd forgotten, but whose kindness had anchored her through the worst hours of recovery. That nurse hadn't provided any medical intervention. Vesha's mother couldn't have managed more expertly. But she'd offered something Dr. Eleanor Mornell had never learned to give: the simple gift of not being alone with fear. As dawn broke over the city, Vesha made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She would approach Arundel directly, not as a superior seeking to supervise his volunteer work, but as a colleague wanting to understand his methods. The idea of admitting professional inadequacy to a warehouse worker went against everything her training had taught her about hierarchy and expertise. But she was beginning to understand that healing drew from sources beyond medical school curricula. She showered and dressed with unusual care, choosing casual clothes instead of her typical surgical scrubs or professional attire. If she was going to have this conversation, she wanted to approach it as Thesha the person, not Dr. Mornell the surgeon. The vulnerability of that choice made her hands shake as she applied makeup. But it felt like the first honest thing she'd done in years. Her first surgery wasn't scheduled until noon, giving her time to intercept Arundel during his morning volunteer hours. She'd noticed from his pattern that he sometimes came in early on Thursdays to visit patients who struggled with daytime anxiety. The thought of approaching him felt more nerve-wracking than performing complex surgery. But she'd spent too many years avoiding the discomfort of genuine connection, driving to the hospital through morning traffic. She practiced what she might say, how she could explain her interest without sounding condescending or intrusive. But every rehearsed speech felt inadequate to bridge the gap between her professional identity and the human curiosity driving her to seek him out. Finally, she decided to trust the same instincts that made her an excellent surgeon, to observe carefully, respond honestly, and let skill develop through practice rather than theory. The pediatric ward was beginning its morning routine when she arrived. Nurses completing shift changes and preparing for doctor rounds. She felt strange walking these familiar halls in street clothes, like visiting her workplace in a dream where everything looked the same but felt completely different. Patients' rooms that she normally entered with medical purpose now seemed like small worlds of private struggle, each one containing stories she'd never taken time to learn. Room 427 was quiet, but she could see Amelia awake, writing in her notebook with intense concentration. There was no sign of Arundel yet, but his canvas bag sat in the visitor's chair, indicating he'd arrived early and stepped out temporarily. Thesha stood in the hallway, suddenly uncertain about her plan, when she heard his voice coming from the room next door, another child's room where he was apparently making additional visits she hadn't known about. The conversation she overheard would change everything she thought she knew about healing, about her own role in her patients' lives, and about the kind of doctor she wanted to become. Thesha moved closer to room 425, where Arundel's gentle voice carried through the partially open door. Inside, she could see him sitting beside a boy who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, his small frame lost in the adult-sized hospital bed, 4 lines threading from his arms like delicate vines. "The brave little mouse," Arundel was saying, his voice pitched lower than she'd heard during his sessions with Amelia. Decided that even though the castle was scary and dark, he couldn't leave his friend trapped inside. "But what if the dragon comes back?" the boy asked, his voice thin with exhaustion. "That's the thing about being brave," Arundel replied. "It's not about not being scared of dragons. It's about caring more about your friend than you care about your own fear." Thesha pressed herself against the hallway wall, recognizing the boy as Tommy Chen, a 5-year-old admitted 3 days ago with severe pneumonia. His parents had been rotating bedside vigils, but his mother worked nights as a nurse at another hospital, and his father was managing 2 other children at home. The boy had been struggling with separation anxiety, crying inconsolably whenever left alone, requiring additional nursing attention that the already strained staff could barely provide. "Will you stay until my mommy comes?" Tommy asked, and Thesha heard the rustle of bedsheets as he presumably moved closer to Arundel. "I can stay a little longer," Arundel promised. "But remember what we talked about? Your mom has to help other sick people too, just like the mouse had to help his friend. When people we love aren't with us, we carry their love inside us like a light, through the gap in the door." Vesha watched Arundel demonstrate something he'd apparently taught the child, placing a hand over his heart and taking slow, deep breaths. Tommy mimicked the gesture, his small chest rising and falling in synchronization with Arundel's breathing. It was a simple grounding technique, the kind taught in basic psychology courses, but watching it applied with such intuitive gentleness was revelatory. "I feel the light," Tommy whispered, his eyes beginning to droop with the exhaustion his anxiety had been preventing him from surrendering to. "That's your mama's love," Arundel said softly. "It's always there, even when she's not. Even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared." As Tommy's breathing shifted into sleep patterns, Arundel remained still for several more minutes, ensuring the child was deeply asleep before moving. Vesha quickly stepped into an alcove as he emerged from the room, watching as he quietly closed the door and made a note in what appeared to be a personal journal, not official hospital documentation, but his own record of each child's needs and progress. Her chest tightened with a recognition she wasn't prepared for. This man was providing systematic emotional care that went far beyond his official volunteer duties, developing relationships and tracking emotional progress with the same dedication she brought to surgical protocols. He was treating the hospital's pediatric ward like his personal mission, one child at a time, with no recognition or compensation beyond the knowledge that his presence mattered. "Dr. Mornell?" She startled, turning to find Sarah, the evening nurse, looking at her with surprise. "You're here early. Is everything okay?" Heat flooded Vesha's cheeks at being discovered lurking in hospital corridors in civilian clothes. "I wanted to check on the Thornfield case," she said, which was technically true, though incomplete. Sarah's face brightened. "She's doing remarkably well. The volunteer reader has been incredible with her. Actually, he's been amazing with several of our patients. Tommy Chun has barely cried since Mr. Castro started visiting him, and little Maria, in 423, has been asking for him by name." 3 patients. Arundel was regularly visiting at least 3 patients, not just Amelia. Vesha felt something shift in her understanding of what she'd been witnessing. This wasn't just casual volunteer work, it was a comprehensive approach to pediatric emotional care being provided by someone with no official medical training but apparently unlimited emotional capacity. "How many children does he visit?" she asked, trying to keep her voice clinically neutral. "I think 6 or 7 regularly," Sarah replied. "He never talks about it, officially stays humble about the whole thing. But the kids light up when they see him coming. We've had several families specifically request him for future admissions, though he always says he just reads stories." 7 children. 7 small patients receiving individualized emotional support that she'd never thought to provide, despite being their surgeon, despite being responsible for their overall care. The scale of what she'd been missing hit her like physical force. "Has he had any formal training?" she asked. Sarah shrugged. "Not that I know of. He's just naturally good with children. Some people have the gift, you know." But watching Arundel's careful documentation, his systematic approach, his intuitive understanding of each child's specific needs, Vesha realized it wasn't just natural gifts at work. This was learned skill applied with scientific precision, emotional intelligence developed through practice and dedication. He'd made himself an expert in pediatric emotional care through observation and trial and error, becoming something the hospital desperately needed, but had never officially recognized. Her phone buzzed with a reminder about pre-surgical rounds. She had 45 minutes before her first procedure, just enough time for the conversation she'd come here to have. But now, having seen the scope of Arundel's work, she wasn't sure what questions to ask or how to approach someone whose volunteer efforts were more comprehensive than her own paid responsibilities. She walked toward room 427, where she could see Arundel now settled in his usual chair beside Amelia's bed. But instead of reading, They were engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation, Amelia showing him pages from her notebook while he listened with complete attention. The scene was so naturally intimate, so clearly beneficial to the child, that interrupting felt almost criminal. Instead, she knocked softly on the doorframe, waiting for them to notice her before speaking. "I'm sorry to interrupt. Amelia, how are you feeling this morning?" It was the first time she'd asked that question and actually wanted to hear the answer beyond medical symptoms. Amelia looked surprised by the inquiry, glancing at Arundel before responding. "Better, I think," Amelia said carefully. "Arundel was helping me understand something about my story. Would you mind if I heard about it?" Vesha asked, pulling a second chair closer and sitting down for the first time in any patient's room. Outside of medical procedures, the next 20 minutes would revolutionize her understanding of medicine, healing, and her own role in her patients' lives. But it would also reveal a truth about Amelia's case that none of them were prepared for, a connection that would explain why this particular child's story had resonated so deeply with both Arundel and herself, and why the healing happening in room 427 was more than just therapeutic storytelling. As Amelia began sharing her lighthouse stories, her voice growing stronger with each page, Vesha found herself listening not just to the words, but to the emotions beneath them, the way Arundel had taught her to do simply through example. And in that listening, she began to hear something that made her blood run cold with recognition: details about family dynamics, about emotional neglect, about a child trying to save herself that sounded impossibly, heartbreakingly familiar. The lighthouse keeper's daughter in Amelia's stories wasn't just fictional. She was autobiography disguised as fantasy, written by a child who understood isolation and abandonment in ways that no 8-year-old should. And as the pieces clicked into place, Vesha realized she wasn't just learning about Amelia's emotional landscape, she was discovering her own story, told through the lens of another child's struggle to find light in the darkness, of family dysfunction and medical systems that healed bodies while ignoring souls. Amelia's voice grew stronger as she read from her notebook, her fingers tracing the carefully drawn lighthouse on each page. Mira learned to tend the light herself when her father worked late into the night, grinding lenses and polishing reflectors instead of reading bedtime stories. She understood that keeping the light burning was more important than her own needs. That ships full of strangers depended on their beacon more than she depended on comfort. Vesha felt the air leave her lungs. The parallel was too precise to be coincidental: a child whose parent disappeared into the demands of saving others, leaving her to maintain emotional equilibrium alone. She gripped the arms of her chair, fighting the sensation that Amelia was somehow reading directly from the hidden chapters of her own childhood. "The worst nights," Amelia continued, her voice taking on a matter-of-fact tone that made the words even more devastating, were when storms came and Mira had to choose between calling for help and managing everything alone. She learned that calling for help just made her father angry about the interruption, so she got very good at handling emergencies by herself. Arundel's expression had grown increasingly concerned as Amelia read, his trained instincts recognizing emotional terrain that went far beyond normal childhood fears. He glanced at Vesha, perhaps noticing her visible distress, before gently interrupting. "Amelia," he said softly, "these are powerful stories. I'm wondering if maybe Mira's father doesn't understand how much she needs him to be more than just the lighthouse keeper." "He thinks he's saving people," Amelia replied, her voice carrying years of practiced understanding that should have been far beyond her developmental capacity. "And he is saving people. The ships make it to shore because of his work. But Mira sometimes wonders if anyone would notice if she disappeared, or if they'd just be sad that no one was left to tend the light." The notebook slipped from Vesha's hands, clattering to the floor. Both Amelia and Arundel looked at her with concern as she struggled to compose herself, her surgical training warring with an emotional response that threatened to overwhelm her professional demeanor completely. "I'm sorry," she managed, retrieving the notebook. "Your story is very moving, Amelia. Very well written." But Amelia was studying Nesha's face with the acute perception of children who've learned to read adult emotions for survival clues. "You look like you've seen Myra's lighthouse before," she said quietly. The observation was so perceptive, so gently delivered, that Nesha felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. This 8-year-old patient had just diagnosed her more accurately than years of medical school training had prepared her to diagnose herself. "Maybe I have," Nesha whispered. The admission feeling like stepping off a cliff, Arundel moved his chair slightly, creating a triangle that included rather than excluded Nesha in their circle of conversation. His movement was subtle but deliberate, the gesture of someone who recognized a fellow survivor and was offering inclusion rather than judgment. "Would you like to tell us about your lighthouse?" he asked, his voice carrying the same gentle patience he'd shown Amelia during her darkest moments. The question hung in the air like an invitation to step into vulnerability that Nesha had spent decades avoiding. Every instinct screamed at her to deflect, to return to professional boundaries, to maintain the careful distance that had kept her safe since childhood. But Amelia's eyes held such genuine curiosity, such uncomplicated acceptance, that the words began emerging before she could stop them. "My mother was a surgeon too," she heard herself saying. "She worked very late, saved many lives, was considered brilliant by everyone who knew her professional reputation." "But not by you?" Amelia asked, with the directness of someone too young to understand that such questions might be inappropriate. "By me too," Nesha clarified. "She was brilliant. She saved hundreds of children during her career, but she never learned to save the child in her own home." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable but contemplative. 3 people sitting with the weight of truth that had been spoken aloud for perhaps the first time. Arundel made notes in his personal journal. Not the mechanical documentation of medical records, but something more like witness testimony, preserving the moment when healing became possible through recognition. "Mara's father isn't evil," Amelia said thoughtfully, returning to her story but now clearly talking about more than fiction. "He genuinely believes he's doing the right thing. He tells himself that providing for her future is more important than being present for her today." "And Mara?" Nesha asked, surprised by her own investment in understanding this fictional child who was becoming less fictional with each sentence. "Mara learned to be very independent," Amelia replied. "She became excellent at managing things alone, at solving problems without bothering anyone, at making sure the lighthouse never failed even when she was sick or scared or lonely." "That sounds exhausting," Arundel observed. "It is," both Amelia and Nesha said simultaneously, then looked at each other with startled recognition. The moment stretched between them, patient and doctor discovering they'd been fighting the same battle from different sides of the medical equation. Nesha saw herself at 8, lying in hospital beds while her mother made rounds, learning that needing comfort was inconvenient, that good children took care of themselves. Amelia saw something in Nesha's eyes that she'd never encountered in an adult, the recognition of shared experience rather than professional distance. "What happens to Mara?" Nesha asked, genuinely unsure whether she was asking about Amelia's story or their shared experience. "I don't know yet," Amelia admitted. "I keep trying to write an ending where her father realizes what he's been missing, where he learns that saving the child in his own lighthouse is as important as guiding strangers' ships to shore. But every time I try to write it, it feels too much like pretending." Arundel closed his notebook and leaned forward slightly, including both of them in his attention. "Maybe," he said carefully, "the story doesn't end with Myra's father changing. Maybe it ends with Mira learning that she deserves to have her lighthouse tended by someone who sees her as more than just the keeper of the light." The suggestion hung in the air like possibility. Neither Nesha nor Amelia had previously considered. That healing might not require the original wound giver to transform. That survival might look like finding new sources of care rather than waiting for insufficient ones to become adequate. But who would tend her lighthouse? Amelia asked, voicing the fear that Vesha recognized as her own, that independence was safety, that needing others was dangerous, that being strong meant never asking for help. Maybe, Arundel said gently. She discovers that she's not the only person who understands what it means to keep important lights burning. Maybe she finds other lighthouse keepers who've learned that taking care of each other makes all of them stronger. As if summoned by his words, Sarah appeared in the doorway with Amelia's morning medications. But instead of the usual clinical transaction, she paused to observe the scene: patient, volunteer, and surgeon sitting together in what was clearly more than a casual visit. "Everything okay in here?" she asked, her experienced eye taking in Vesha's civilian clothes and emotional demeanor. "We're talking about lighthouses," Amelia explained, which was technically accurate, though completely inadequate to describe what had actually transpired. Sarah smiled, unaware that she was witnessing a moment that would fundamentally alter how care was provided in the pediatric ward. "Well, lighthouse conversations seem to be good medicine. Your vitals have been better this week than any time since admission, Amelia." After Sarah left, the three sat in comfortable silence, processing what had been shared. Vesha found herself thinking about her surgical schedule, but differently than usual. Instead of focusing solely on technical procedures, she was wondering about the emotional states of her young patients, about the fears they carried into the operating room, about the lonely recovery periods she'd never considered part of her responsibility. "Arundel," she said finally, "would you be willing to teach me some of what you've learned about helping children through medical experiences?" The request surprised all three of them. Hospital hierarchies didn't typically flow in this direction: surgeons asking warehouse workers for professional guidance, medical degrees deferring to experiential knowledge, clinical expertise seeking emotional training from volunteers. But Arundel responded without hesitation. "It would be an honor," he said simply, "though I think you might discover you already know more than you realize. Sometimes healing happens when we stop trying to be professional helpers and start being human beings who understand suffering." As Vesha prepared to leave for her first surgery of the day, Amelia asked one final question that would follow her into the operating room and beyond. "Dr. Mornell, when you operate on children, do you ever think about their lighthouses? About whether they have someone to keep the light burning while they're asleep and can't do it themselves?" The question struck Vesha with the force of medical revelation. She'd spent years perfecting surgical techniques, ensuring physical healing, measuring success in terms of functional outcomes. But she'd never considered that her unconscious patients might need their metaphorical lights tended just as urgently as their bodies needed repair. "I will now," she promised, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her, walking toward the surgical wing. Vesha carried Amelia's question like a new diagnostic tool, a way of seeing her patients that would transform how she practiced medicine. But more than that, she carried the recognition that healing her own childhood wounds might be inseparable from learning to tend the fears of the children she served. That becoming the surgeon she wanted to be required, becoming the person she'd never been allowed to be, the lighthouse metaphor had given her a new way to understand both her past and her purpose. But the most profound revelation was still to come: the discovery that learning to heal others might be the only path to healing. Herself, the 6-year-old girl on the operating table, looked impossibly small beneath the surgical drapes, her chest rising and falling with mechanical precision under anesthesia. Maya Patel had been born with a complex congenital heart defect that required multiple surgeries throughout her short life. And today's procedure would determine whether she'd need a heart transplant or if her own organ could be repaired to sustain her into adulthood. Dr. Vesha Mornell stood at the scrub sink, her hands moving through the familiar ritual of surgical preparation. But her mind was elsewhere in room 427. Hearing Amelia's question echo with unprecedented clarity, "Do you ever think about their lighthouses? About whether they have someone to keep the light burning while they're asleep?" For 15 years, she'd approached surgery as a mechanical problem requiring technical solutions. Patient history, diagnostic imaging, surgical approach. Anticipated complications. Her preoperative mental preparation had always focused on the physical challenge ahead, the complex choreography of repairing damaged anatomy. But standing at the sink, watching the surgical suite prepare through the viewing window, she found herself wondering about Maya Patel's inner world, about the fears a 6-year-old might carry into her 4th cardiac surgery, about who would tend her emotional lighthouse while Vesha worked on her heart. Dr. Mornell? The surgical resident, Dr. James Chen, approached the sink beside her. "Maya's parents are asking if they can see her once more before we begin. I told them she's already under, but they seem quite distressed." In the past, Vesha would have given a brief explanation about surgical protocols and the importance of maintaining sterile fields. Parents' emotional needs were someone else's responsibility: social workers, chaplains, nursing staff trained in family support. Her job was the surgery itself, not managing ancillary anxieties that might interfere with her focus. But Amelia's lighthouse stories had planted something in her consciousness that was beginning to bloom into a different understanding of healing. "How long have they been in the waiting room?" she asked. "Since 5 this morning," Dr. Chun replied. "This is her 4th surgery, and her mother mentioned that Maya has been having nightmares for weeks leading up to today." Nightmares. Like Amelia's evening panic attacks. Like her own childhood terrors of medical procedures that came with clinical efficiency, but no emotional preparation. Vesha finished scrubbing, her hands now clean but her thoughts contaminated with questions that had never occurred to her before. "Tell them I'll speak with them before we begin," she said, surprising both Dr. Chun and herself, "and ask the anesthesiologist to give me a few extra minutes." The waiting room was a study in controlled desperation, families maintaining composure while their worlds hung in balance. Magazines opened but unread, conversations conducted in whispers that wouldn't tempt fate. Maya's parents, Priya and Dev Patel, sat apart from the others, their body language screaming the particular exhaustion of people who'd become experts in medical crisis through repetition rather than choice. Vesha approached them still in surgical scrubs, her presence immediately commanding their attention. They looked up with the mixture of hope and terror she'd seen thousands of times, but never really absorbed until this moment. "Mr. and Mrs. Patel," she said, sitting in the chair across from them rather than standing with professional distance. "Dr. Chen mentioned that Maya has been having nightmares about today's surgery." Priya Patel's composure cracked slightly. "She keeps dreaming that she goes to sleep and forgets how to wake up," she whispered. "We've tried to explain that the doctors will take good care of her, but she's only 6. She doesn't understand why she has to keep going through this." The naked pain in the mother's voice hit Vesha with unexpected force. She delivered post-operative reports to hundreds of families, discussed surgical risks with clinical detachment, but she'd never sat with parents in the anticipatory grief of watching their child disappear into medical procedures they couldn't control or fully understand. "What does Maya love most?" she asked, the question emerging from some newly awakened part of her consciousness. Dev Patel looked surprised by the inquiry. "She loves butterflies," he said. "She has a butterfly garden at home, knows all their scientific names. She says they prove that beautiful things can happen even when you have to go through difficult changes." The metaphor was so perfect, so achingly appropriate, that Vesha felt something shift in her chest. Here was a 6-year-old who developed her own philosophical framework for understanding transformation through adversity, who'd found beauty in the concept of metamorphosis because it made sense of her own repeated medical procedures. Would you like to tell me more about her butterfly garden? Vesha asked. I want to understand what Maya cares about before I work on her heart. For the next 10 minutes, she listened as Maya's parents described their daughter's passion for butterflies, how she'd named each chrysalis in their backyard garden, how she'd created detailed drawings of the metamorphosis process, how she'd announced that her heart surgeries were like cocoon time, where she had to go into darkness so something better could emerge. The conversation was making her late for surgery, disrupting the carefully orchestrated schedule that kept operating rooms functioning efficiently. But as she absorbed Maya's understanding of transformation, Vesha realized she was receiving more valuable preparation for this procedure than any surgical manual could provide. I want you to know, she told Maya's parents, that while I'm working on her heart, I'll be thinking about her butterflies. I'll remember that she understands transformation, that she's brave enough to go into cocoon time because she trusts that emergence is possible. Walking back toward the surgical suite, Vesha carried Maya's story like a talisman. But more than that, she carried a new understanding of her role that extended beyond technical expertise to something that felt more like sacred responsibility. She wasn't just repairing cardiac anatomy, she was tending the lighthouse of a 6-year-old who'd chosen butterflies as her symbol of hope. The operating room hummed with its familiar symphony of monitors and ventilators. But Vesha approached Maya's draped form with unprecedented awareness of the person beneath the surgical field. This wasn't just a complex cardiac case requiring her technical skills. This was Maya Patel, butterfly enthusiast, philosopher of transformation. A small person who taught herself to find beauty in the necessity of change. Before we begin, she announced to the surgical team, I want everyone to know that our patient is 6 years old, loves butterflies, and understands that sometimes beautiful things require difficult transformations. Let's make sure we're worthy of her trust. The statement was unusual enough to draw surprised glances from the nursing staff and residents, but nobody questioned it. Instead, something subtle shifted in the room's energy. A heightened sense of purpose that elevated the procedure from routine surgery to something more meaningful. As Vesha made her first incision, she found herself thinking about cocoons and metamorphosis, about the courage it took to surrender to transformation, trusting that emergence was possible. Maya's heart appeared in the surgical field, small and damaged but still fighting, pumping with the determination of someone who'd already survived multiple repairs and was prepared to endure. Another, the defect was more complex than the imaging had suggested. Scar tissue from previous surgeries had created additional challenges, and the repair would require innovative techniques that pushed the boundaries of her expertise. In the past, this discovery would have triggered pure technical focus, her consciousness narrowing to the mechanical problem demanding solution. But working with Maya's butterfly metaphor in mind, Vesha found herself approaching the surgery differently. Each careful suture became part of Maya's metamorphosis. Each technical decision weighted with awareness that she was facilitating transformation rather than just fixing broken anatomy. The precision remained the same, but it was precision informed by purpose that extended beyond technical achievement. 3 hours into the procedure, complications arose that would test everything she'd learned about healing. Maya's heart began showing signs of arrhythmia, irregular rhythms that suggested the repair might be triggering electrical instability. The monitors erupted in alarms, the surgical team moving with practiced efficiency to address the crisis. Lidocaine, 2 milligrams per kilogram, Vesha ordered, her hands continuing their work while her mind calculated options. Maya's heart was rejecting the repair, fighting against the very intervention designed to heal it. In cardiac surgery, this was always a possibility, that the trauma of fixing might temporarily overwhelm the organ's capacity to function. But instead of viewing this as a technical failure, Vesha found herself thinking about butterfly emergence, how the process of leaving the cocoon was often the most dangerous part of metamorphosis, How many butterflies died in the struggle to break free from the very structure that had protected their transformation? Maya's heart was struggling with emergence, fighting to adapt to its new configuration while maintaining the essential rhythms of life. "Talk to me about her condition," she said to the anesthesiologist, her voice calm despite the crisis. "Is she stable enough for me to give her heart more time to adjust?" "Vitals are holding," came the reply. "But these rhythms can't continue indefinitely." Vesha paused, her hands poised above Maya's chest, caught between the medical imperative to act quickly and an intuitive sense that Maya's heart needed space to find its new rhythm. In the past, she would have proceeded with immediate intervention, electrical cardioversion, additional medications, whatever technical response the situation demanded. But she found herself thinking about Arundel's approach with Amelia, about the patience he'd shown in allowing healing to unfold at its own pace rather than forcing it according to medical timelines. Maya's heart was trying to learn a new way of beating. And perhaps what it needed wasn't more intervention, but skilled attention while it figured out how to function in its transformed state. "Let's give her 60 seconds, she decided. "Monitor everything, but let's see if her heart can find its own rhythm." The surgical suite filled with tense attention as everyone watched the monitors. Maya's heart struggling with its new configuration, while her surgical team held space for the uncertainty of emergence. Vesha kept her hands positioned to intervene if necessary, but her focus was on witnessing rather than controlling, on being present for Maya's metamorphosis rather than directing it. 30 seconds passed. 45. The arrhythmia continued, irregular and concerning, but not deteriorating. And then, at 57 seconds, something shifted. Maya's heartbeat found a new pattern, different from before, but steady, strong, sustainable. The monitors settled into rhythms that sang of successful transformation. "There she is," the anesthesiologist said softly. "Our butterfly is learning to fly." The remainder of the surgery proceeded with unprecedented smoothness, Maya's heart accepting each additional repair, as if it had found confidence in its own capacity for adaptation. When Vesha placed the final sutures, she felt something she'd never experienced in 15 years of surgery. Not just professional satisfaction at technical success, but profound gratitude at having been privileged to witness transformation. In the recovery room, as Maya began emerging from anesthesia, her first words were, "Did my heart learn to be a butterfly?" Vesha found herself sitting beside the bed, taking the small hand in hers, the first time she'd ever made physical contact with a patient outside of medical procedure. "Yes," she said softly, "your heart is definitely learning to fly." As Maya's parents arrived for reunion, tears streaming down their faces at seeing their daughter awake and stable, Vesha realized something profound had shifted in her understanding of medicine. Technical expertise remained crucial, but it was expertise applied with awareness of the whole person, with recognition that healing involved both body and spirit, with understanding that her role extended beyond mechanical repair to tending the lighthouses of small souls, navigating transformation, walking back toward the pediatric ward. She found herself eager to share this revelation with Arundel and Amelia, to tell them that their lighthouse metaphor had fundamentally changed how she practiced medicine. But more than that, she wanted to continue learning from them, to discover what other aspects of healing she'd been missing in her pursuit of technical perfection. The story of Maya's butterfly heart would become legendary in the pediatric wing. But for Vesha, it represented something even more significant. The moment she'd learned that the most profound healing happened when medical expertise merged with human connection, when technical skill served not just physical repair, but the deeper transformation that made life worth living. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of room 427, where Amelia Thornfield sat cross-legged on her bed, no longer a patient but a visitor. Her kidney function had returned to normal 3 months earlier, but she returned to Havenbrook every Tuesday and Thursday, not for medical treatment, but to read her stories to other young patients who were learning to navigate their own storms. And that's how Mira discovered. Amelia read to 7-year-old Marcus, who was recovering from appendix surgery, that lighthouse keepers work best in pairs. When one person gets tired of keeping the light burning, someone else can take over for a while. So the ships always have guidance home. From the doorway, Arundel watched with the quiet satisfaction of someone witnessing seeds he'd planted growing into something beautiful. Amelia had transformed from a frightened patient into a natural healer, her own experience of fear and recovery giving her stories authentic power to comfort others. Her notebook had evolved into a published collection titled Mira's Lighthouse, Stories for Brave Sailors, with proceeds funding the hospital's new pediatric emotional support program. She's becoming quite the storyteller, Dr. Vesha Mornell said softly, joining him in the doorway. She wore casual clothes. It was past her official hours. But she'd developed the habit of staying late to visit with patients who needed more than medical care. 6 months of learning from Arundel had revolutionized her practice. The pediatric wing now included mandatory emotional support protocols, with trained volunteers working alongside medical staff to address the psychological needs of young patients. Vesha had completed formal training in trauma-informed medical care, but her most valuable education had come from observing Arundel's intuitive understanding of fear and healing. "How's the new program developing?" Arundel asked, referring to the comprehensive emotional support initiative they designed together. "Beyond our expectations," Vesha replied. "Patient anxiety scores have dropped 40%. Length of stay has decreased by an average of 2 days. And family satisfaction ratings are the highest in the hospital's history. But more importantly, the children are healing differently, not just physically, but emotionally." The program had become a model for pediatric hospitals nationwide. Medical schools were beginning to incorporate emotional support training into their curricula, recognizing that technical expertise without human connection was incomplete healing. Vesha had been invited to speak at conferences about integrating psychological care into medical treatment, though she always credited Arundel as the true architect of the approach. "Your mother called," Arundel mentioned gently. This had become part of their Thursday routine, checking in about family relationships that were slowly, carefully being rebuilt on new foundations. Vesha nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than anxious. "We're having dinner this weekend. Actually talking, not just discussing medical cases. It's strange learning to have a relationship with her as people instead of just professional colleagues." The reconciliation with Dr. Eleanor Mornell had been gradual and complex. The older surgeon had initially been baffled by her daughter's new emphasis on emotional care, viewing it as inefficient sentimentality that detracted from medical excellence. But watching Vesha's improved outcomes, seeing how emotional support enhanced rather than hindered medical treatment, had slowly opened her to reconsidering her own approach. "She mentioned that she's been reading to patients at her retirement facility," Vesha continued. "Apparently, she's discovered that bedtime stories are more effective than sleeping pills for residents with anxiety." Amelia finished her reading session and approached them, her face bright with the satisfaction of someone who'd found meaningful work. "Dr. Mornell, did you tell Marcus about the butterfly girl you helped last week?" "Maya Patel is doing beautifully," Vesha replied. "She brought me pictures of the new butterflies in her garden. She says each one represents a child who's learned that transformation can be beautiful, even when it's difficult." The three of them walked together toward the elevator, their unlikely friendship having become the foundation for a new model of healing that was spreading far beyond Havenbrook Medical Center. Arundel had been offered full-time positions at several hospitals, but he'd chosen to remain at the warehouse while expanding his volunteer work, training other veterans in pediatric emotional support techniques. "Kieran's soccer game is Saturday," he mentioned as they reached the elevator. "You should both come if you're free." This too had become part of their new reality, the recognition that healing communities extended beyond hospital walls, that the people who tended lighthouses together became family in ways that transcended professional relationships. Victoria Thornfield had been the most surprising transformation of all. Witnessing her daughter's remarkable recovery and seeing the importance of emotional presence had prompted her to reevaluate her own priorities. She'd reduced her work hours, started attending family therapy with Amelia, and begun learning to be present rather than just productive. "My mom's bringing cupcakes to the game," Amelia announced. She learned how to bake them herself instead of buying them from the hospital. Cafeteria. The small details of ordinary life had become profound victories for families. Learning to prioritize connection over achievement, presence over productivity. Vesha found herself envying the simplicity of soccer games and homemade cupcakes. Experiences her own childhood had lacked, but which she was slowly learning to value through her chosen family of fellow healers. As they parted ways in the parking garage, each heading to their separate lives, the bonds between them remained strong lighthouse keepers who'd learned that the most important lights were the ones they tended for each other. Arundel drove home to an apartment that still showed signs of careful management by someone living with invisible wounds, but which now also displayed evidence of healing community, photos from hospital events, handmade cards from young patients, a shelf of children's books annotated with notes about which stories worked best for different types of fear. Vesha returned to an apartment that was gradually becoming less sterile, more alive with the accumulated evidence of a life being actively lived rather than professionally managed. She'd started cooking actual meals, keeping fresh flowers, displaying gifts from grateful families rather than just medical awards. Amelia went home to a mother learning to ask about feelings rather than just symptoms, to family dinners that prioritized conversation over efficiency, to bedtime stories read by a parent who was discovering that her daughter's emotional needs were as important as her academic achievements. 6 months earlier, none of them could have imagined the healing that would emerge from a simple volunteer reading program. They'd each been isolated in their own forms of professional or emotional survival, the veteran struggling with invisible wounds, the surgeon defending herself with clinical distance, the child learning to minimize her own needs to accommodate adult priorities. But in room 427, reading stories about lighthouses and brave sailors, they discovered something that medical textbooks couldn't teach, and therapy couldn't prescribe: the healing power of authentic human connection. The transformation that occurred when people learned to tend each other's lights. During the darkest storms, the pediatric wing of Havenbrook Medical Center had become more than a place where children's bodies were repaired. It had become a lighthouse itself, a beacon proving that healing was possible when technical expertise merged with emotional wisdom, when professional competence combined with human compassion, when the people responsible for saving lives remembered that the most important salvation often had nothing to do with medical intervention and everything to do with the simple act of not letting anyone face their storms alone. In hospitals across the country, other lighthouse keepers were learning the same lesson, that the most profound healing happened not when fear was eliminated, but when it was witnessed; not when problems were solved, but when people were seen; not when pain was cured, but when suffering was shared by those brave enough to sit in the darkness until morning came. And in room 427, where it all began, a small plaque now hung beside the window: every lighthouse keeper needs someone to tend their light when the storms become too fierce to weather alone. It was unsigned, but everyone who worked in the pediatric wing knew it had been placed there by 3 people who'd learned that the most important medical intervention of all was simply refusing to let anyone heal in isolation, proving that sometimes the greatest surgery was performed not on bodies, but on the spaces between souls, where connection made all the difference between surviving and truly living. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.